Welcome to Pursue Wisdom, the teaching podcast of Bethlehem Church in Austin, Minnesota. I'm Pastor Paul Steele, and we are in a sermon series called Asking for a Friend. We all have questions when it comes to God, the Bible, what it means to follow Jesus. And we would like some answers to those questions to give us confidence in what we believe. And so my prayer is that in this sermon series, you will be encouraged, that you will be given some reasons on why you can know that following Jesus is the absolute best way to live. Let's get into the sermon.
Today is the first sermon of two sermons that deal with culturally controversial topics where we who follow Jesus find ourselves kind of out of step with the rest of the culture. And so today, the question that we come to answer is this: how should Christians think through the trans conversation? How should we who follow Jesus enter into this conversation that is happening within our culture well, in a way that represents Jesus? Rip Van Winkle is a short story written by Washington Irving. And the story deals with a guy named Rip Van Winkle who lives in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And Rip is a friendly guy. He's likable. He's helpful. But Rip is also very lazy and tries to avoid work whenever he can. And so one day he wanders into the mountains and he comes across this group of guys playing games and drinking, and he joins in and has a little too much to drink and falls asleep. And he wakes up and he notices everything's different. He has this long beard, his gun is rusty, his dog's gone. And as he wanders back into town, he realizes that 20 years has passed. He slept for 20 years. And now he comes back to a town and a culture that has changed. And the story is about how does he navigate that? What is life like as you're trying to adjust to the cultural change that has happened? And I think for many of us, we have had this Rip Van Winkle moment experience. We may have not have fallen asleep for 20 years, but it does feel like, in some sense, that we went to sleep one night and we woke up the next day and the culture that we live in is totally different, and we feel out of place, and we're trying to find our place within this culture, and we're like, what in the world happened? And one of the reasons why we feel that way is this whole trans conversation. We're like, what is going on here? See, we feel out of place for a couple reasons. One is that we lack the context. Like most of us don't even consider our gender. It's just, we just are. And so for us to hear somebody say, well, I'm a man, but I feel like a woman, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body or whatever, like we don't know what that even really means. We lack the experience. We can't really understand what they're saying. A second reason why we feel out of place in this is the fact that our culture has told us this is what we as good Americans now must believe, affirm, and think. And to think differently than the rest of our culture means that you're a bad person, you're transphobic, you're a bigot, and whatever. Like we feel like we can't even disagree or ask questions without being labeled as somebody who is bad. and outside of cultural norms. Like, you're just a bad person. So we feel out of place. We don't quite understand everything that is going on. So what are we to do? How do we, as followers of Jesus, how do we respond to all of this? Well, we need to first of all remember that we are called to represent Jesus well in this world. And so our main goal, right, is to reflect the image of God, to represent Jesus, that we're his ambassadors. And so it's crucial that we do this well because we're representing Jesus. And in order to do this, we have to build a firm foundation. And the first block of this foundation is that we have to be true to what the Bible teaches. We have to be true to what the Bible teaches. And when it comes to this conversations about gender, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about our modern ideas. But it does tell us enough, it does teach us enough to give us the right direction, the right ways to think about things, or the way that God wants us to think about things. So when it comes to gender, in this conversation particularly, what we find is that the Bible teaches us that we are to live our lives according to our biological sex. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, God prohibits cross-dressing, for women to dress as men and men to dress as women. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, Paul is talking about things that are improper for followers of Jesus or for God's people to do. And one of the things that he lists there is that it is wrong for the New Living Translation says for Christians to be male prostitutes, for Christian men to be male prostitutes. Other translations will say it's improper for them to be effeminate. So what happened in the first century in this context is that you did have some men who were gender confused or confused gender and took on more of a female role. And so Paul is saying that is improper for those who follow Jesus to do. We're not to misrepresent who we are. And so if we're going to represent Jesus well, we need to, that first block is that we need to be true to what the Bible teaches. The second block is that we need to remember that when we enter into conversations like this, that our fight is not against flesh and blood, right? But against ideas and teachings and deceptions. Paul writes this in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. For we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. And so what Paul affirms is that that creation, that the world that we live in is more than what we can see and touch. That there are spiritual beings, and we talked about this when we answered the question, why does God allow evil and suffering? That there are that God created a host of spiritual beings and gave them certain responsibilities and powers, and that some of these spiritual beings corrupted, rebelled against God, and yet they still have this authority. And so these spiritual beings are actively corrupting and deceiving people. That's part of what the Christian worldview is. And so they are presenting and deceiving and bringing in false ideas and false philosophies. And so we who follow Jesus, then, our job is to speak the truth. And so we are waging war, not against people, not against individuals, but against ideas and philosophies. And so that is what we must answer. That is what we must focus on. And the third block of our foundation is that we have to make a commitment to love individuals. We have to make a commitment to love individuals. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells one of the most famous of his parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so here you have a man who is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he's attacked by bandits. He's beaten up. He's left for dead. And you have a Levite who walks past him and does nothing. You have a priest who walks past him and does nothing. And then this is what Jesus says starting in verse 33. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I will pay you the next time I am here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same." Jesus made the despised Samaritan the hero of this story. That even though he was despised by the Jews, when he came across a Jewish man who was hurt and in need of help, what did he do? He sacrificed his time, he sacrificed his money to show kindness and care for that man. One of the greatest commitments that we need to make right now is having this realization that even if we're despised by the culture, even if the trans community doesn't like us, that we have this commitment at the core of who we are, because this is what it means to follow Jesus well, that we will love, that we will serve, even those who would rather that we not exist. That is the foundation for how we respond to all these difficult conversations, because that is the foundation of what it means to represent Jesus well in this world. So what do Christians need to know if we're going to enter into this trans conversation well? What do we need to know to do this well? So the bulk of the rest of this message is taken from an article written by Preston Sprinkle entitled 5 Things Christians Need to Know to Engage in the Transgender Conversation. Now, Preston Sprinkle has a doctorate. He's been a college professor. He worked for a time with Francis Chan in San Francisco. In fact, Preston Sprinkle and Francis Chan wrote a book together entitled The Racing Hell, which was a response to Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, where Rob Bell is arguing for Christian universalism, and Francis Chan and Preston Sprinkle wrote this book defending the doctrine of hell, which we talked about a few weeks ago. But after that, Preston Sprinkle entered into into the LGBTQ conversation, and he wrote a book about same-sex attraction in the church and the Bible, entitled People to Be Loved. In 2017, he helped start the Center of Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And then in 2020, he wrote the book Embodied, which is about transgender identities, the church, and the Bible. And over the years, his podcast, Theology in the Raw, is one that I listen to all the time. And he's talked about these issues a lot on that. And so I've really appreciated his approach because I feel like it's filled with both grace and truth. And so in this article, he says there are 5 things that we as Christians need to know in order to enter into this conversation well. And the first thing that we need to know is that trans people are people, not issues. Trans people are people, not issues. See, it's easy to enter into these conversations and think that it's a debate. And we debate issues, and we debate policies, and we debate that, and we debate this. And what we miss and what we forget is that underneath it all are people. People who are created in God's image. People who are hurt. People who are filled with pain. People who are trying to find their place in this world. And so that should soften our conversations. That should remind us that what is really at stake is not winning a debate, but loving people. The first thing that we need to remember is that trans people are people and not issues. The second thing that we need to remember is that sex is different from gender. That might come to a surprise to some of you, because up till 1970, universally across the board, sex and gender were the same. You use them interchangeably. And most of us still have. But when in this conversation, the 2 things are different. So sex means your biological sex. Humans, like most other species on this planet, are what is called sexually dimorphic. And that simply means that in order for new life to happen, you have to take the sperm from the male and the egg from the female, and they come together and new life happens. And so you have 2 categories of sex, male and female. This is not disputed. This is not, this is science. That's the reality. Biological sex, there are 2, male and female. Gender is a little bit more complicated. Gender, then, is how you live out being male or female in this world. And so it encompasses psychological stuff and social stuff and cultural stuff. Right? It deals with identity, gender expression, gender roles. They all play a part in this. And so primarily at the root of this conversation is gender identity. Who am I? Who am I? And so one of the great questions is that when it comes to there being an incongruence between somebody's felt gender and their biological sex, why does that happen? Is it an ontological reality? That being, is this feeling about gender, is that really a part of who you are at the core of your being, in your spirit? And so that you really were, quote unquote, born in the wrong body? Or is it a subjective feeling? Why are you feeling this incongruence between who you are, who your felt identity is, and your biological sex? Which also leads us to the question of, well, what should determine your identity? Should your external body determine it? Or should your internal feeling be what determines it? So that's kind of at the root of what this whole discussion is. How do we live out the identity that we feel? And when there's an incongruence there, what do we do about that? So sex and gender are different. The third thing that we need to remember is that trans people are diverse. Trans people are diverse. Dr. Mark Yarhouse says that if you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. That everyone's experience is different. And so you have some transgender people who experience what is called gender dysphoria. Now, gender dysphoria is a real psychological thing. And what happens is that you feel a distress. So a mental, physical, spiritual distress at trying to live the gender of your biological sex, that causes you distress. And so for some, that comes on in childhood. And others, that happens in adolescence. Then you have some people who don't experience gender dysphoria at all. And you have some people who want to transition, and others who don't. They just want to live this out, this expression of being the opposite gender. And so we have to keep that in mind, that when we hear one person's story, we can't just throw that and map that onto everybody's experience. That when we hear some story about a person who transitioned and then now has regret and transitioned back, that doesn't mean that everyone will. That's one person. And it's also important here to remember that we can't be dismissive of people's experience. This is a real thing. We can't dismiss it by just saying, hey, that's some guy who wants to live as a woman. No, there's real psychological things that are happening to people because of this. So we need to keep that in mind, that trans people are diverse. Their experiences are diverse, just like all of our experiences are diverse. We need to listen to individuals and relate to individuals. The fourth thing that we need to remember is that our bodies are good. Our bodies are good. Now, the Bible, again, doesn't address our modern concerns about gender, but it still has things to say. And the foundation of what it has to say is this: that our sex bodies are good. Earlier I read from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And here we read, so God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. We are created in God's image, male and female. Men and women can demonstrate God's character in different ways. Not all the same. Part of what this means, that God created us in his image, male and female, is that we have the ability, men and women have the ability to demonstrate God's character, reflect God's glory in different ways. But it also means that part of what God meant when he created us in his image was to give us biological sex. And part of representing God in this world happens through being men, and it happens through being women, and it's good. God created our bodies good. And one of the things I think it's so crucial to remember is that because our bodies are good, and remember, we talked about this when we talked about what happens when you die, that when our spirit and body go together. And that Paul says, when I leave this body, there's going to be a little bit of distress, even though I'm with Jesus, because I'm out of my body. And the resurrection tells us that we will get new bodies. That part of what being human is to have a body. Our bodies are good. And so we want to avoid anything that brings harm to our bodies, that changes our bodies. Our bodies are good. And so our sex is not our total identity. But neither can our sex be separated from our identity. Part of what it means to be us, part of what it means for me to be Paul, is to be a man. You can't separate that reality, that part from my identity. So our bodies are good. The fifth thing that we need to remember is that most gender stereotypes come from culture, not the Bible. Most gender stereotypes come from culture and not the Bible. So the Bible recognizes two sex, male and female. But it also teaches that man is to represent God, but it also teaches that to be a man who represents God or a woman who demonstrates God's character is different than the cultural norms of how men and women should live. So, for example, when we read the Bible, we read that men, people who follow Jesus, men who follow Jesus are to be kind, that they can have deep relationships and friendships with other men, David and Jonathan. We are taught in the Bible that men should be tender-hearted, that they can be emotional. Read the Psalms. The Psalms are written by men who are emotional, who cry out to God. We are told that men who follow Jesus are to turn the other cheek and not instigate fights. We are told that men are to love their enemies rather than to kill them. And think about what the Bible teaches about women. The Proverbs 31 woman is a good example, that here you see her not only manage her household, but to run a business, to make a profit. She's described as having strong arms, and she stands up for social justice issues. What it looks like for us who follow Jesus to be men and women of faith isn't necessarily going to line up with the cultural norms of gender stereotypes that we have. And so we have some freedom there in what that looks like. Think about this, for example. Jacob and Esau. Esau is this manly, hairy man. He goes out and hunts, right? He loves the wilderness. You have Jacob, who's a mama's boy, stays at home, does the cooking. They're both men. They may live it out differently, but that's who their gender, what they do doesn't define what their gender is. Or you have the example of Deborah, who lived outside the cultural norms for her context, right? Because she's a judge, which means she's a leader in Israel. She's a prophet, which means she teaches God's word. So we need to remember that gender stereotypes are descriptions of how men and women usually live within their cultural context. They're not biblical prescriptions. They're not biblical commands. So we have a lot of freedom there in what it looks like to be a man, to be a woman who follows Jesus. So now, hopefully now, that kind of helps give you a context of what this whole conversation is about in the first place. How should we who follow Jesus, who are disciples of Jesus, enter into this conversation? Well, first, we need to remember that our most profound impact will happen at the individual level. Our most profound impact will happen at the individual level. With the trans person, with the trans ally that we personally know. And so we need to make a commitment to love. So we tell them, hey, I love you. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to help you when I can. But part of loving is speaking the truth. I heard this phrase this week, and it's just kind of stuck with me. Clarity is kindness. Clarity is kindness. We don't want to do a bait and switch where we say, oh, I love you, and then when the time comes, we're like, oh, no, I can't support you in that. No, we want to be kind, and so we're going to be clear. We're going to say, hey, I love you, I'm going to be there for you, I'm going to help you when I can, but I can't support you in this. I can't support your transition because I think for you to really have an identity, it first has to be rooted in Jesus. That you ultimately aren't going to find happiness living the opposite gender. And we know this to be true, right? We know this to be true because when a poor person says, hey, all I need is more money, and they win the lottery, what happens? They become miserable. They blow through that money. The money didn't make them happy. Why? Because the core problem of their heart wasn't a lack of money. Or a person who says, oh, I'm so lonely, all I need to do is I need to get married. I need to have that identity as a wife or a husband, and that's going to make everything better. And yet they get married and they're still unhappy. Why? Because ultimately at the root was not their need to change their identity to a husband or a wife to have that relationship. It's something that needs to happen within here. And so if you haven't really dealt with the root cause of your discontentment and of your unhappiness, just making a physical change isn't going to solve the problem. And so we say, we think God has a better plan for your life. That you need to find your identity, not in your gender. That should not be the most important thing about you, but in Jesus. And so we need to this is how, and so then what happens? Most likely, if we say this, what's going to happen? That relationship is going to end. It's going to break. So sometimes we can't just accommodate people in order to maintain a relationship with them. We have to be kind by being clear and telling them the truth. Recognizing that the risk is the loss of the relationship. But when the time comes and that person needs some help, they need a place to stay, we have this commitment to love them. And we offer them in. And even though they may despise us, even though they may hate us, they will experience Jesus' love through us. And that's why it's so important for us to make this commitment to love, regardless of how they might feel about us, because that is what it means to follow Jesus. And the second thing, so the most profound impact that we have in this conversation happens at the individual level. But what about the public level, the public square? Because we still live in a country where supposedly we have a voice in what happens. And so what we want to make sure that we do is that we support laws and policies that give voice to families and parents and children. That as soon as we start to make policies and laws that take away the rights of parents and their children, we're giving more authority to the state, and we're diminishing the role that the family plays in our culture. And so many, we don't have enough information yet to even know if these laws and policies are good for people to begin with. For instance, I talked about gender dysphoria. For children who go through gender dysphoria, or experience gender dysphoria, now the percentages range widely here, but anywhere from 61% to 88% of the time, when that child goes through puberty, the gender dysphoria deceased, or it ends. So even if we go with that lower number, 61%, the majority of children who experience dysphoria will no longer be an issue once they go through puberty. Why in the world would we make policies and laws that encourage giving hormones and puberty blockers to children when most likely, once they become a teenager, it's no longer an issue? And so we need to make our voice known. May not make a difference, but that's part of what we need to let people know. We need to stand for the truth. We need to stand for the truth and allow parents to be the biggest influence in the lives of their children. So our goal in this conversation, and our goal in all difficult conversations within our culture, is simply this. We want to represent Jesus well. The Bible calls those who follow Jesus ambassadors. We are to represent Jesus and his kingdom and do it in a way that honors him. So we do that. So we honor Jesus well. We do that by remaining true to what the Bible teaches, fighting a war of ideas with truth, and making a commitment to love. That's how we represent Jesus well in these conversations. Our big idea this morning is simply this: Christians are to enter the trans conversation with love and truth. And we realize that our primary purpose isn't to persuade, because we're probably not. It's not to persuade people, but to represent Jesus, to honor him. And the way we live and the things that we say, we want to represent Jesus well. So our challenge this week is to pray. We want to pray for the trans people in our lives that we may know. We want to pray for the trans influencers that are in our culture, that are influencing our young people through TikTok and YouTube and other. We want to pray for that. And we want to pray for wisdom for our policymakers, that they will do the right thing. This is a difficult but crucial conversation to be part of. And the way we do it matters. The way we enter into this conversation totally matters, right? It's not just the way we say things, it's the tone that we have. We know this in our personal conversations. So when we enter into these conversations, it's not just about what we say, it's about how we say it. And so the way we do this matters. And we want to make sure that we do it in a way that honors Jesus. That is our goal. That in everything that we say In everything we do, we honor Jesus.
We don't have to worry about the questions that we may have. God's not afraid of them. There are good answers to the questions that we have. And I am confident that as we seek these answers, God is going to use the whole process to strengthen our faith and make us into the people that He created us to be. Keep on asking those questions and keep on looking to God.